London wore its winter brilliance like armor that night, bright enough to wound. Carriages queued along the crescent, wheels whispering over frozen ruts, while footmen lifted lanterns as if raising small moons to guide the favored inside. Within the Crown Patronage ballroom, chandeliers bloomed with light, throwing diamonds across polished floors and gilded cornices. Music tuned itself into expectation. The air held lilies, beeswax, and the unspoken understanding that worth could be weighed, measured, and dismissed with a glance. She arrived as an afterthought made visible. At 22, of gentle birth and careful manners, she had learned to stand straight without demanding notice. Her gown was modest but well kept, the seams mended with patience rather than gold, the color chosen to flatter without provoking comment. An invitation, secured through obligation and remembered late, had brought her here. No fortune had escorted her through the doors. She paused at the threshold long enough to gather her breath, then entered with composure, carrying her small courage like a hidden coin. Eyes assessed her swiftly. They admired and moved on. Beauty was not her failing. It was her poverty that whispered louder. Fans flicked, shoulders turned, and names were murmured with the faintest smile of mercy. A matron, lacquered in confidence, inclined her head and offered a courtesy that landed like instruction. One must be chosen to be seen. The girl accepted the lesson without flinching, anchoring herself near the wall where the light softened faces and shadows could pass for company. The orchestra struck its first confident measures, and the floor filled as if by instinct. Gloves met gloves. Promises were remembered, alliances rehearsed. She waited. When a gentleman approached, it was only to offer apology polished to a shine. Another bowed, eyes skimming past her shoulder towards safer prospects. A third laughed quietly with a friend and pretended not to see. Each refusal arrived dressed as politeness, yet the sum of them pressed her inward, urging her to fold smaller, to disappear between notes. She did not beg. She did not plead with her eyes. Instead, she watched the dancers with a steady attention that did not accuse. It was this restraint, the way she refused the performance of need, that kept her upright when humiliation threatened to bend her. She thought of the quiet lessons taught by necessity. Mend what you can, endure what you must, never ask the room to love you. If she could leave with dignity intact, she told herself, the night would not have one. Across the room, a man stood apart from the gaiety, listening rather than joining. 30 years had shaped him into economy of movement and word. War had taught him what noise could conceal. Parliament had taught him how silence could rule. The Duke's presence required no announcement. He surveyed the assembly as one might read a field before choosing ground, measuring currents, weighing risks. When his attention settled, it did not flicker. It held. He noticed her because she was still. While others angled their smiles toward advantage, she remained anchored, her gaze clear, her hands quiet at her sides. The contrast struck him with the force of something honest in a practiced world. He saw the minute tension in her shoulders, the careful calm that followed each small cut. He understood endurance when he saw it, and he had grown weary of those who mistook performance for worth. Whispers followed his recognition like birds taking flight. A cousin leaned in to murmur a reminder of expectations. A political ally smiled too thinly. The Duke acknowledged none of it. The orchestra shifted into a new set, brighter, demanding pairs. The girl, bracing herself for another gentle refusal, felt the familiar heat rise behind her eyes and willed it down. She had decided how this would end, with grace and soon. Then the floor seemed to change beneath her. The Duke crossed the distance with purpose that neither hurried nor hesitated, a line drawn through the room that parted conversation and stilled laughter. Fans paused mid-sweep. Bows faltered. He stopped before her and inclined his head with a courtesy exact enough to feel like shelter. The music waited. The night leaned forward. He extended his hand, and the space between them held its breath. For a heartbeat, she wondered if the room had conjured him out of mercy, a vision shaped by want. Then she saw the steadiness of his hand, the lack of curiosity in his eyes. This was no amusement. Around them, judgment recalculated itself, sharp as a blade turning. She felt the risk in the air, the cost of acceptance pressing against her ribs. To refuse would be safer. To accept would be seen. She measured her fear and found it smaller than the ache of standing alone. Her glove met his palm, cool leather against warmth, and the smallest tremor betrayed her resolve. He did not tighten his grip. He did not reassure. He simply waited, granting her the dignity of choice in a room that thrived on taking away. The orchestra lifted its bow. Somewhere, a whisper curdled into scandal. As she stepped forward, the chandeliers seemed to flare brighter, and London, startled by its own cruelty, prepared to watch itself be defied. The Duke smiled once, not kindly but certain, and the first note fell, sealing a moment that would not be undone forevermore. The moment they joined the set, the room seemed to fracture along invisible seams. Music resumed, bright and insistent, yet it carried a new weight, as though every note were being judged for its loyalty. He guided her with a precision that neither claimed nor constrained, his hand steady at her back, his posture offering partnership rather than command. She matched his steps with careful grace, aware of her pulse, aware of the sudden heat of attention that followed them like a second rhythm. Whispers bloomed and collided. Fans fluttered faster, concealing mouths sharpened by surprise. A mother tightened her grip on a daughter's arm, recalculating futures. The Duke's name moved through the air with astonishment attached, as if the title itself had misbehaved. He danced as though none of it existed, counting the measures, reading the floor, attentive to the smallest shift in her balance. When she faltered once, he corrected not with force, but with timing, allowing her dignity to remain intact. She felt herself steadied by his calm. It was not flirtation that passed between them, but something more dangerous, recognition. He spoke only when the figures required it, his voice low, exact. "You move as if you listened first," he said, not praise but observation. She answered with honesty she had not rehearsed. One learns when one must. The exchange landed between them, private as breath, while the room strained to overhear. At the end of the set, custom allowed release. He did not release her. Instead, he inclined his head to the musicians and remained. The second set began, and then a third. Each time he chose her again, the decision rang louder. Scandal ripened into certainty. A young lady of impressive jewels attempted a smile that curdled midway, her chosen partner suddenly attentive elsewhere. A gentleman laughed too brightly and earned a look that stilled him. The Duke's persistence was not loud, but it was complete. By the fourth set, the room had surrendered its pretense. Judgment no longer hid behind courtesy. She felt it press against her gown, crawl up her spine, question her right to stand where she stood. The Duke seemed to sense the strain and altered his hold, a subtle shift that communicated shelter without spectacle. "If you wish to stop," he said, eyes forward, "we may." She shook her head, surprised by her own steadiness. To stop now would confirm the room's power. To continue was to claim something she had never been offered. When the music finally stilled, applause arrived uncertainly, a thing unsure of its allegiance. He escorted her from the floor, ignoring the currents that tugged at him, and placed her near the edge of light. Only then did he release her hand. "I thank you," he said, and in the restraint of the words lay intention. She curtsied, heart loud, and watched him withdraw with the same unhurried purpose that had carried him to her. The ball continued, but it had been altered. Invitations were revised in murmurs. Promises were tested. She found herself alone again, yet the solitude had changed shape. It no longer diminished her. It waited. As she prepared to leave, a footman approached with a small parcel, unmarked, offered without comment. Inside lay a single winter bloom, pale and resilient, wrapped in paper inscribed with a line from a poem she knew by heart. No signature intruded. The message was neither public nor coy. It was precise. The gift unsettled her more than a dance. Flowers could be explained away as whim. This could not. She folded the paper and tucked it close, aware that such a token, discovered, might be wielded against her. The carriage ride home passed in quiet, the city's lamps blurring into a river of light. She replayed his stillness, the lack of spectacle, the gravity that had made choice feel inevitable. By morning, the consequences arrived. A calling card returned unopened. A note from a former patroness expressed regret in practiced phrases and withdrew an invitation long promised. The words were soft, the meaning was sharp. Her name had acquired weight overnight, and the weight pressed downward. She stood at her window, the bloom on the sill, and considered the cost of being seen. That afternoon, a rumor reached her through a servant's careful hesitation. There would be another assembly, more exclusive, where her presence would be conspicuous by its absence. Some said it was mercy, others called it correction. The Duke's choice had split the room, and the fracture was widening. She closed her eyes, the poem's line repeating itself like a vow not yet spoken, and wondered whether courage could survive the silence that was being prepared for her. The room the Duke chose was not meant for spectacle. It was a withdrawing room set back from the main thoroughfare, its tall windows curtained against the afternoon glare, its walls softened by age rather than fashion. A small fire breathed steadily in the grate, carrying the clean scent of wood rather than smoke. Here, applause could not intrude. Here, voices learned to lower themselves or fall away entirely. She arrived precisely when the clock completed its measured strike, escorted by propriety and little else. The chair offered to her was plain, the table between them bare save for a single book placed carefully aside. The Duke stood until she settled, then resumed his seat without ceremony. He did not begin at once. The pause was deliberate, granting her space to inhabit herself without performance. In that stillness, she felt the weight of the room lift from her shoulders. "I did not wish to speak to you where others might mistake the sound," he said at last, his tone even, unadorned. She inclined her head, uncertain whether gratitude or caution should answer first. The fire marked time for them, each small shift a punctuation. Outside, a carriage passed, the world continuing without invitation. She told them what the city had already decided, that invitations had cooled, that names once spoken with warmth now arrived edged with regret. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. The facts fell from her like coins counted honestly, each one necessary. When she finished, she held his gaze, braced for the familiar consolation that disguised dismissal. What came instead was attention. He listened as one listens to testimony, not for advantage, but for truth. "They mistake consequence for correction," he said. "It is a habit of crowds." He did not apologize for them. He did not promise to mend it. He acknowledged it as weather, dangerous because it pretended to be natural. She surprised herself by speaking again. "I am not ashamed of being poor," she said quietly. "I am ashamed of how easily they decide that it must make me smaller." The words left her with a tremor she did not hide. To confess such a thing felt like removing armor she had not known she wore. The Duke leaned back, considering her as one considers a map that refuses simplification. "I did not ask you to dance because you were overlooked," he said. "I asked because you stood as if you had chosen yourself already." The admission did not flatter. It clarified. He told her then of war without detailing its violence, of Parliament without naming its games, of the exhaustion that followed years spent among men skilled at appearing earnest. "I have learned to distrust volume," he added. "Conviction is quieter." She absorbed this without haste. If this was courtship, it was unlike any she had witnessed. There was no gallantry offered as shield, no pity disguised as favor. Instead, there was a recognition that felt mutual and therefore dangerous. She asked him why he had sent the flower. He allowed a pause, then answered with care. "Because it endures winter without pretending it is spring," he said. The honesty of it unsettled her more than any declaration might have. She rose and crossed to the window, placing a hand against the cool glass, not to look out, but to steady herself. "Your choice has cost me," she said. "It may yet cost you more." The room tightened around the thought. Outside, the city waited, patient and sharp. He joined her at the window, not close enough to claim space, close enough to share it. I am not unacquainted with cost, he replied. What I will not accept is silence that pretends to be safety. He told her then of the pressures already assembling, the cautions offered by those invested in his alliances. He spoke of a future that could be smaller if he wished it so, easier if he withdrew. He did not ask her to rescue him from it. What do you ask? She said, turning to face him fully. The question landed with a courage that startled her. He met it without retreat. I asked to know you without the room, he said, and to be known in return. He offered her not secrecy, but correctness. Letters written, calls made, a courtship conducted in daylight. Protection, yes, but not erasure. The promise shifted something in her chest, a hinge long rusted beginning to move. Yet fear rose with it, practical and sharp. If she accepted, the scrutiny would sharpen. If she declined, the silence would complete its work. She looked at the book on the table, at the waiting fire, at the man whose stillness had changed the shape of a ballroom. As she gathered her gloves, a servant appeared with news spoken too softly to be casual. Another assembly was planned, more select, and her name was being weighed for exclusion with an intention that felt final. The Duke's expression did not change, but the room seemed to lean toward him, awaiting decision. She felt the moment balance on a thin edge, aware that whatever followed would no longer be hers alone to bear. The assembly was arranged as correction disguised as celebration, its invitations cut narrower than usual, its guest list polished to reflect itself. Light gathered obediently into chandeliers, and the room hummed with the confidence of those who believed exclusion to be a form of order. She arrived because silence had become heavier than scrutiny, and because retreat would have written the ending for her. Her gown was simple, her posture composed, and every step carried the memory of doors quietly closed. Eyes turned with practiced interest, then sharpened. The patroness who had withdrawn her favor stood near the center, smiling as if nothing had been arranged at all. Conversation flowed around her, careful not to include. The girl felt the familiar narrowing, the subtle instruction to remain small. She held her ground, recalling the Duke's words about daylight, about refusing safety that asked for erasure. If this was to be the moment, she would meet it standing. A ripple disturbed the room, a hesitation moving from shoulder to shoulder. The Duke had arrived without flourish, his presence altering the temperature of the space. He did not scan for advantage. He did not pause to be acknowledged. He crossed directly to her side, the line of his movement unmistakable, and offered his arm with a formality that carried weight. Murmurs stuttered. Fans stilled. The patroness's smile tightened. He spoke clearly enough to be heard without raising his voice. "You will walk with me," he said, not as request, but as inclusion. She placed her hand on his sleeve, the decision made without spectacle. Together they moved into the light, the assembly rearranging itself unwillingly to accommodate them. The Duke did not shield her from looks. He let the room see him choose. When the challenge came, it arrived wrapped in manners. A gentleman, emboldened by company, remarked upon propriety, upon prudence, upon the dangers of encouraging misunderstanding. The Duke turned, his attention precise. "There is no misunderstanding," he said. "There is preference." The simplicity of it struck harder than rebuke. A laugh tried and failed to take hold. The patroness stepped forward then, her voice honeyed with concern. She spoke of suitability, of a natural order of matches, of the care owed to reputations larger than individual feeling. The Duke listened, nodded once, and answered with a calm that carried authority. "If your order requires her to be diminished for your comfort," he said, "then it is the order that stands in error." The room held its breath. Lines were drawn without being named. She felt the moment turn toward her, felt the old fear ask her to soften, to yield. Instead, she straightened and spoke with the steadiness learned in quiet rooms. "I have not asked to be rescued," she said. "I have asked to be regarded." The words landed not as plea, but as boundary. A few faces flushed. Others looked away. The Duke took her hand, this time without pretense of custom. "I will be plain," he said, and his voice carried to the edges of the room. "I intend to marry this woman." Shock broke against the walls like weather. He continued, unhurried. I do so with full knowledge of consequence, and with greater regard for what endures. He turned to her then, and the public moment narrowed into something fiercely private. Will you have me, he asked, as I am, without apology? She answered not at once, because dignity demanded breath. When she spoke, her voice did not waver. Yes, she said. The single syllable reshaped the evening. Some departed quickly. Others lingered, recalculating. The patroness retreated, her certainty diminished to posture. Their marriage followed without ostentation, correct in every particular and sincere in its restraint. Morning light filtered through the chapel windows, pale and honest. Vows were spoken softly, with an economy that trusted itself. When he placed the ring upon her hand, it was with a gentleness that made spectacle unnecessary. Witnesses later disagreed on details, but none forgot the quiet gravity of it. London did not forgive at once. It rarely did, but it learned. Invitations resumed, altered in tone. Letters arrived, edged with respect. The couple withdrew to a life that valued substance over audience, where evenings were spent by firelight and mornings opened onto work that mattered. She became visible not because she was elevated, but because she was regarded. He became gentler without losing authority. Years later, the story would be told as a caution or a romance, depending on the teller's courage. But on that night, as they left the assembly together, the Duke paused at the threshold and looked back once, not in triumph, but in recognition. London watched them go, unsettled by the knowledge that it had been seen clearly, and humbled by the certainty that love, chosen openly, had refused to ask permission at all.